about reporting the trade union movement, suddenly the language that I'd recognized way back in the 1980s reappeared. We had trade union barons, you know, these powerful people suggesting they were unelected. In fact, all our trade union leaders had to stand for election every 5 years. Wild-eyed left-wing militants, extremists. The language of the 1980s during the bitter struggles of the miners' strike, of the print workers at Wapping, it all came back. And so it gave me the idea we need to actually think, why is it happening, and where are the journalists reporting the labour beat, as you call it, or industrial correspondents, as we call them in the UK? Well, they've disappeared in the UK. There's one left. His name's Alan Jones. He works for the Press Association. He does a great job. Parallel experience here. You haven't got a labour beat. They've gone from the most newspapers. And interesting fact, I looked at some research that Media Tenor did back in early March. And it looked at your mainstream television network for 6 years, from 2004 just into 2011. And it came up with a staggering statistic that if you monitor all of the news for those 6 years, the amount of coverage of trade union and labour issues on the mainstream networks is 0.1%. 0.1%. Now, think about it, all those millions of people facing cutbacks, closures, unemployment, all of the things that people struggle with, and it's invisible, in terms virtually invisible. I have to tell you, there was one channel, however, where it wasn't invisible. Fox News carried the highest proportion of stories about trade unions and labour. And as you can guess, it was unremittingly hostile, negative coverage. So, that's why I thought we should put this panel together. And then Madison happened. And what I thought was going to be in a tiny little room tucked away there has suddenly become something bigger. And I just want to quote, and then I'm finished, and I'm going to hand over to the panel. I want to quote from Laura Flanders. She did an interview. By the way, I was watching all this stuff. I was absolutely absorbed in what was going on here. And I could list all of the sources, an incredible array of sources, where I could find out what was going on in Madison. But I was watching Grit TV, and Laura Flanders had got Michael Moore on. And this is the quote that I think is at the core of what we want to talk about today. Laura Flanders was saying, what was extraordinary was that the more people stayed in Tahrir Square in Egypt, the more media attention they got. The longer people have stayed in occupation in that state house in Madison, the more they have protested, with over 100,000 on the streets in Madison on Saturday, the less attention they got from the mainstream media. Now, that's the issue, which we want to discuss. We want to diagnose the problem today and suggest some solutions. Now, my first speaker, I actually watched quite a lot of. He was bobbing around in the background at Madison. I thought, I know that man. I know that man. John Nichols, The Nation.
Oh my goodness me, look at this. Well, many of us have spoken before, and I used to be really excited to speak at these huge National Conference of Media Reform events. But once you've spoken to 150,000 people in Madison, you know, you get a little bit greedy for crowds, and that's okay. We should be crowd junkies. We should want to have great masses of people show up and push against the doors of power until those doors open, and we go into those capitals and we say, if our legislators and our political leaders will not represent us, then we will represent ourselves. Now let me do a couple quick things up front. Granville, who's an incredible friend, an ally, comrade, is the author of a great book called Shafted. If you have not seen this book, it's one of the best books ever written anywhere on labor coverage, well, Best book ever, yeah. No, I was actually going to put the proviso in, so be careful. On labor coverage of strike situations. It's a book about the miners' strike in the 1980s in Britain, and it was that strike that politicized me. And I was politicized as any good radical would always be via the songs of Billy Bragg. And Billy Bragg did a wonderful version of Which Side Are You On? That was critical to that struggle. Get a copy. Also, we got other great writers here, and I tell you, this is your chance. We have people who've been writing about labor for a long time, know their way around, buy their books, take a look at what they're doing. You're gonna see that labor has been covered over the years. The problem is it just hasn't gotten the attention that the good work of people like my fellow panelists have done. Let me also note that, and I'm going to actually, a little bit later, I'm going to slightly hijack the panel and suggest that we do a shout out here to some of our community media folks from Madison. But I will tell you that nobody in Madison, Wisconsin, who followed this struggle was able to keep up with it without the great work of WORT, our community radio station in Madison, Wisconsin. So we got so much to talk about today. I don't want to give you a big speech, and I can tell you about all the beautiful stuff and all the great stuff of Madison, and I think I've done that individually with each and every one of you. But what I want to focus in on is our subject today, and I give you, I think, the critical study of the crisis. You all know what happened in Madison. I don't have to detail the situation. The governor of Wisconsin tried to pass a radical anti-labor bill as part of a budget repair. People came to the streets, first 50, then 100, then 1,000, then 10,000, then 100,000, then 150,000, and more, all over the state, an incredible uprising. And what was most amazing about it was the terror of power in the face of people. Power got freaked out. They had not seen so many people in a long time. Elections are supposed to be distant, and once the election is done, the people go away, and they get to govern for 4 years, and they don't have to see us. And all these people are there, and they got so freaked out that finally, about 3 weeks into the struggle, the governor and his legislative allies decided they're going to pass the bill. They literally just popped it up. They said, we're going to pass the bill tonight. They gave less than 2 hours' notice. They violated the state's open meetings laws. Thousands of people rushed to the Capitol, an amazing scene. It was like the Minutemen and Minutewomen. People, racing up, jumping out of their cars. By the time, within that 2 hour period, more than 7,000 people surrounded the Capitol chanting, stop the bill, kill the bill. It was an amazing moment. But they did pass it that night. And the next day, on Thursday, they passed in the Assembly. Both houses of the legislature signed it. And then passed it, this governor then signed it. And I picked up my New York Times, the Journal of Record of the United States of America, publication that tells us exactly what's going on. Once you've read the New York Times, you don't need to know anything else. And I looked at my article there, and it said, Wisconsin struggle is over. It's done. I mean, that's it. It's done. The legislature, the people will go home. Off with you. And I thought, damn, this was so cool. And now it's over. And that was Friday. And on Saturday morning, I went down with my daughter about 4 miles south of Madison to see my good friend Joel Greeno, who's a farmer. And he was coming in. He'd asked some other farmers to come on in. And there were about 50 of them. They had their tractors. And we got on. My daughter and I got on the front there, and we rode into town. And first off, we saw about a dozen kids with their little signs saying, thank you, farmers. And then came a little closer, as maybe 100 people. And then cars started pulling along beside us, and they'd all learned to honk, this is what democracy looks like, beep, 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 beep. And we were like, wow, this is pretty, it's kind of interesting. I thought this thing was over. And then we came rolling into downtown Madison, and we rolled up that hill toward the Capitol, past our county courthouse. And as we came into the square on this very cold, frigid morning, we were greeted by 150,000 Wisconsinites who don't read the New York Times. And so, be careful what you read. But let me tell you that this is emblematic of the struggle in Wisconsin. This kind of gets to the heart of the problem. Everything about the way that major media has covered the Wisconsin struggle is rooted in assumptions about the labor movement and about the support that people give to the labor movement. And the assumption is, it's two very simple assumptions. One, the labor movement is a dinosaur waiting to die, and two, the American people are out there with pitchforks and guns and whatever else trying to kill it. Because we hate labor, and we hate unions, and we hate collective bargaining. We despise. Man, if you've got a blue collar, we hate you. And so, it's a very simple equation. We all know what's going on. This is what all of our media tells us again and again. We only sort of like labor if it's, someplace, maybe in Egypt. Labor union in Egypt, that's kind of cool. They come out, that's okay. A foreign country, labor rights, yes, labor rights are human rights in other countries. But America, So you get those concepts. And then, two quick little interventions here. See, I'm not beating on the New York Times. The New York Times is just, the only reason I talk about the New York Times is because everybody talks about Fox and Rush Limbaugh. If Fox and Rush Limbaugh didn't exist, we'd still have exactly the same problem that we have. Because it is not Fox and Rush Limbaugh that make the New York Times misreport labor. It is assumptions based on the think tanks and all the operations of the political right, frankly, and corporate America that makes this happen. It is not just conservative media. So the New York Times came out, and they sent a reporter out to cover this labor struggle. Oh, fabulous. Great. Good. Always good to have somebody from the Times out. In fact, they had two of them out, and it was public employees, right? And so they, of course, went for the essential story, which is, because they knew it to be true, the people hate public employees, right? We hate our teachers. We hate the people that plow our roads when it snows. We hate the people that pick up our garbage. We hate the people that if we get sick, take care of us in the hospital. We despise these people. So once the public employees are out there protesting, it was just, snap the fingers. Go find some private workers who hate public employees. No problem at all. The New York Times went down to Janesville, Wisconsin, a deindustrialized factory town where the GM plant had recently closed. They went to a bar because, of course, all workers drink. And they go sit down at the bar, and there they find a worker, and seemingly a blue collar, I assume. Would you display? You have a blue collar here, ma'am? And you show it that there's a blue collar, and they said. And I assume the New York Times reporter having, they probably had translators and stuff so they could speak to a working class person. Just in a loud, slow voice. Are you from here? Do you work with your hands? Noble laborer. And the noble laborer said, "Why, yes, I do work with my hands. I'm a former auto worker here in town, former union member, and I hate those public employees. They're just horrible. They get great pensions and great pay, and I'm not jealous of them. I just hate them." And so New York Times put it on the front page. Private sector workers don't agree. Private sector workers think public workers are lazy, fat, and have great pensions. They come across Lake Mendota and Madison on their yachts to do their 2 hours of work and then pick up their paycheck and then head back to their mansions. And they are despised by the working people of Wisconsin. And this went on the front page of the New York Times. Why this is important is the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, got a call one day from a blogger known as The Beast. Ian Murphy, who lives in upstate New York. The blogger known as The Beast was going to call Scott Walker and say, he's going to pretend to be Hosni Mubarak, giving him a call of solidarity, saying, stand up, don't let him push you out. I'm not kidding, I interviewed the guy, and he said, but I couldn't get the Egyptian accent down. So when I called, I thought, whose call would Scott Walker take? And David Koch, the billionaire Koch brother guy who funds the Tea Party movement. And so, not kidding, goes, gets to the governor's office, and the governor's secretary says, David Koch on line 1. Governor picks up. And as many of you know, the call was recorded. The governor thinking he was talking to a billionaire campaign contributor. And in the middle of the call, this guy playing David Koch says, well, how are things going out there? And he says, well, the press coverage is pretty good. There was just a New York Times article that was great. It went on the front page. They said private sector workers hate public sector workers. And I'm photocopying that and handing it out to everybody. Well, the front page of the Times had that article. What was funny was the correction appeared inside, only about 2 lines, which said, the worker interviewed in Janesville didn't work at the auto factory, and he wasn't a member of the United Auto Workers, and we spelled his name wrong. They got everything wrong. And the following Saturday, from when that story appeared, the factory workers from Janesville, United Auto Workers Local 95, formed a mass contingent in the march supporting the public workers at the Capitol. So let me bring us around full circle here. Once all these things had happened, the New York Times decided to do an incredible thing, and this other media too. They went out and they polled. They said, what do you think of labor unions and workers? They asked the American people. And the poll came back and it showed, well, 70, 80% of the American people like unions. 65, 70% of the people like collective bargaining. Great majorities like public employee unions and teacher unions. And they're like, the New York Times people go, well, it must be a polling error. So there's a glitch here. And seriously, people thought there's got to be something wrong. And then Time Magazine went out, did the same poll, got the same results. Again, there must be a polling error. Something must be wrong. And then they asked the pollster, and the pollster said, well, I think I've got the problem here. We haven't polled on labor in 30 years. We haven't asked anybody what they actually thought about labor unions and collective bargaining and public employee unions. And so we didn't really have a very good baseline on this. And what was the baseline for the last 30 years? The baseline for the last 30 years was spin. It was fantasy. It was a lie. And our media, not just the New York Times, certainly not just Fox and Rush Limbaugh, the whole of our media, our mainstream media system, accepted the lie, incorporated the lie into all its coverage, and created the fantasy that Americans don't like unions, that Americans don't like teachers in particular, think they're paid too much. All the things that you've heard, they're all false. They were never real, and yet they existed as an absolute truth in our media. And why did they exist as an absolute truth in our media? Because for the last 30 years, in fact, honestly, for the better part of the last 60 years, we have been in a steady decline in labor coverage in this country. In 1940, we had more than 1,000 labor reporters covering unions in this country. Today, on major media outlets, we have, at best, 5. They're gone. Most of them don't do any labor coverage. Even the labor reporters aren't allowed to cover labor most of the time. It is an absolute culling out and a denial of a beat. When unions are on strike, they don't even mention the names of our unions. They say the unions are out there. Can you imagine if they were writing a story about GM or Boeing or any company and they said the companies are making profits? No, they name the companies. Why won't they even name the unions? The answer is they have neglected us. They have denied us. They have been totally dysfunctional and disreputable in their approach to the trade union movement. And finally, the people of Wisconsin have come to the streets, and the people of Indiana are in the streets, and the people of Ohio are in the streets, and the people of Michigan are in the streets, and the people of Maine are in the streets saying, you are wrong, and we are coming to prove to you that the American people stand on the side of the labor movement, not the side of a lying press. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, John. A great start to this session. I just need to make one quick announcement. The cards are going round. It seems to be the way we do this conference. You put your cards in, and we're going to get the panel to respond. Okay, I want to move on. Well, I want to move back. I want to move back to December 2008. And I recall the Peter Finch outburst in Network. Do you remember it? We were mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. And this is what happened in Chicago at the Republic Doors and Windows factory. An occupation. Took me back to labor history, Flint in the 1930s. We're really fortunate in having our next speaker, Carrie Lidderson, who's written a wonderful book called Revolt on Goose Island, and she'll be signing copies of it after this session. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Carrie.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the media coverage of, I'll give just a very brief history of the Republic Windows situation. I think people probably have heard about it. So in December 2008, this kind of medium-sized, family-owned window company closed down without giving the workers any notice, and the workers were members of the United Electrical Workers, and they'd had a really brutal battle to unionize with the UE. They'd sort of kicked out a mob-controlled union a couple years earlier and built a lot of cohesion through that. So they could tell that something fishy was going on at the plant. The equipment was disappearing in the middle of the night, and management kept saying that nothing was up, but the workers expected a shutdown was imminent. So they came up with a plan to occupy the plant. And ideally, I think they wanted to keep it open, but what they ended up demanding was their severance pay, which the owners had violated the Warren Act by shutting down without giving them any notice. And then, under the Warren Act, they were mandated to give 60 days severance pay, and the workers were also due a lot of vacation pay that they hadn't taken. So the workers occupied the plant for 6 days and were essentially demanding the money that was due them. And it was a pretty, especially from kind of a reporter's standpoint, it was a really interesting strategy to cover, because the real villain who was directly screwing over the workers was the owner of the window factory, who's now facing a whole host of felony fraud charges. But this was a guy who nobody knew, and probably had his money. Oh, back? Okay, sorry. Probably if he did have the $3 million sum that was due the workers, he probably had it hidden in a way that they wouldn't be able to get it. So the union targeted Bank of America, which had been one of the creditors, and they sort of blamed Bank of America for cutting off credit to the company. And as it turned out, Bank of America didn't really have any legal obligation to pay this money, and in my opinion, they were justified in cutting off credit, since this guy was defrauding them as well as defrauding the workers. But it really tapped into a larger anger and fear, and this was right after the bailout. And Bank of America is one of the banks that was really aggressively pursuing foreclosures. So Bank of America and Chase Bank did ultimately pay a little bit less than $3 million, which really is, is not much to them, but symbolically it was a huge victory that the workers, through a really massive outpouring of public support locally and nationally and even internationally, convinced the banks to do this. So the media coverage, almost immediately, it was pretty amazing to see, because of the dearth of media coverage, and especially sympathetic media coverage of labor. It was pretty amazing to see that almost really from day one of the occupation, not surprisingly, alternative and labor media, but also the mainstream media really jumped on the story. And there was a lot of factors that came together to make that happen, which haven't really been replicable in a lot of other situations, although I think, maybe not with some of the New York Times stories, as John was saying, but I think in general, some of that, mainstream narrative, portraying workers as the heroes did come out with Wisconsin. But anyway, so the mainstream media, including Fox, outlets that you don't normally see covering labor or doing stories in any way sympathetic to labor, just really embraced this as sort of an American. The Congressman Luis Gutierrez had a nice catchphrase. He called it a Chicago Christmas Carol. So really just this, story of workers. But one thing that was interesting about the mainstream media coverage is it sort of missed a lot of the nuances, either intentionally or unintentionally, and it kind of reminded me of how Rosa Parks has been portrayed in history. Mainstream media coverage made it sound like these workers suddenly came to work and the factory was closed, and they just spontaneously decided that they were going to occupy the plant. And the union organizers, and international staff were definitely interviewed extensively in the media, but I feel like the mainstream media did kind of downplay the actual role of the union and the fact that there was this really progressive and innovative union at the plant, and did sort of cast it as, that kind of typical American story of individuals just working together, but as individuals just suddenly making this decision. And that really, in a lot of ways, was an injustice to the long history of organizing both at that plant and, more broadly in Chicago, and all the solidarity from other unions that played a big role. So I think that even though this story did really spread like wildfire in the mainstream media, I think a lot of the nuances in regards to the labor movement and what actually made it successful were missing. And then, so I wanted to talk a little bit about another campaign that the UE, the same union, is doing in the Chicago suburbs, and how that kind of compares to the Republic Windows and Doors situation. So Republic Windows and Doors involved about 250, 300 workers directly, who are directly employed there. And by the way, the factory was bought by a California company that has kept it open and has promised to hire back all the workers, although it's been kind of slow going, and they've only hired back about 30 so far. So it was a victory in the sense of keeping the plant open too, although not as resounding a victory yet as people would have liked. So that involved, about 300 workers, a window factory, a struggle that has gotten a lot less attention, but I think is actually in some ways even more, is relevant to a larger number of people, and, could have sort of longer lasting ripple effects, is their campaign to organize warehouse workers in this, what they call a dry port in the Chicago suburbs. It's actually the nation, or even the Western Hemisphere's biggest transfer point for cargo, things coming in those shipping containers from the West Coast and being redistributed around the heartland. So there's at least 150,000 workers employed there, and these are about as, at least in, the Chicago area, about as kind of exploited as you could get. There are people that are, a huge portion of them are working temporary jobs, even if they've been working these jobs for 10 years or more. They're employed by these staffing agencies that hire people for 3 months or 6 months, and then continually lay them off and then hire them again so that they avoid paying benefits or having any kind of seniority. And, it's in a lot of cases pretty dangerous and unhealthy work, and very low paid, and hard to unionize, extremely hard to unionize, because it is this largely temporary workforce. And a lot of the workers there are ex-offenders, so they, bring up themselves that they're even more vulnerable because their criminal records make it that much harder for them to get work somewhere else. So a lot of them do feel just grateful to have this job and don't want to rock the boat. And as at Republic Windows and Doors, a lot of them are immigrants also, and may have issues with their immigration status that also makes them more unwilling to, to make waves. So it's a big battle, to say the least, to try to organize people in the warehouses. And it's the kind of thing where the way the logistics, the goods movement, as they call it, industry is organized now, everything is so computerized and by the minute. When something's scanned at a Walmart, that automatically transmits to the warehouse, and something will be put on a truck at exactly the right time to replace that inventory exactly when it's needed. So I feel like it's the kind of situation where if you could occupy a warehouse or block a warehouse or do something even for a short amount of time, you would really make an impact both symbolically and even financially, because this system is so finely tuned. If you interrupt it even for a little bit, it could have really big results. And it's also the kind of situation in terms of media and public support where strategically sort of choosing the bad guy is really important. In the case of Bank of America, they chose Bank of America instead of the window factory owner because that would resonate a lot more with the public. With these warehouses, the ones kind of on the front lines of exploiting the workers are these staffing agencies, but nobody knows who these companies are. Even the huge multinational shipping companies, a lot of people, you might see their names on shipping containers, but a lot of people aren't really familiar with them or don't feel a connection to them. But obviously Walmart and Target and Home Depot and stores like this are where the products are ultimately ending up. So the union and their allies are kind of making Walmart and the other big box stores, the named adversaries in this battle. And people might have heard there's a tour going on right now of Walmart workers from Bangladesh and some of these warehouse workers and people and actual Walmart associates, people along the supply chain talking about the workers' rights abuses that go on at all different levels of the supply chain, and trying to connect those rather than having them seen as isolated struggles. So this campaign hasn't gotten a lot of media coverage yet. It's gotten really great local media coverage from 1 or 2 reporters in these suburbs. And in Chicago, myself and a few other labor reporters have covered it a good bit, but it hasn't really hit the mainstream public consciousness. So I think that kind of shows just how tricky it is to craft a media strategy and to get attention for, both the existence of an issue and then also the campaign targeting this issue that really is a huge deal and, is central to the products and goods that people use pretty much every second of their lives. So anyway, I'll wrap it up now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Carrie. I just want to mention that Carrie and the next speaker, Mike Elk, work and file copy for Working in These Times, which I think is great. First of all, I think what they do is great, but I also think that space is great. But I also thought, it occurred to me that these are some of the things or some of the sources I go to in the UK to find out about what's in America. Working in These Times, obviously, Mother Jones, Common Dreams, Real News Network, Grit TV, Democracy Now!, Labour Start, The Nation. So that's where I find out about what's going on, what my perspective is. And the material that I read from Mike Elk tends to be tough stuff. Mike has got very strong views, and I'm really glad that we can give a platform to his views about how we should try and get Labour back into the mainstream media and also get the stories across for people to read. So, Mike, over to you.
Thanks for the great introduction. And give money to Working in These Times. I promised my editor I'd plug it. So, inthethes.times.com, donate, memo, give money to Mike Elk. So I was thinking about what to say today, coming up here, and I was thinking about the name of the panel, and it's called Taking the Pulse of the Labor Beat. And I was thinking about that, taking the pulse of the labor beat, and I realized I was the only person on the panel who's on Twitter. And I think that kind of says something about the subject of the panel, that we've had a tough time making labor a big part of the general discussion, especially among young folks. It was really funny because when I first came to DC and I started writing, I was out with one of my mentors, William Grider, and we're at an event. And Grider introduced me to some union guy, and he says, "Hey, I want you to meet this guy. This is Mike Elk. He's the best labor journalist in the country under the age of 25. And I'm sitting there like really, really flattered and thinking, wow, my mentor said I was the best labor journalist in the country under the age of 25. And then he adds, he's also the only one. So, and this brings back to a key issue, which is that in Wisconsin, we saw this incredible upsurge of youth people, and everybody was talking about all these young folks coming to the labor movement. They're coming in with their hip-hop songs and all this crazy stuff. The hipsters are showing up. They're in their skinny jeans and their ironic signs, and they're showing up at the rallies. I mean, really, the hipsters with the ironic signs. I don't know, Micah noticed this, but there was all these hipsters with these signs that said, "Teach me how to doogie" in Wisconsin. It wasn't really covered by the mainstream media, but it was just really ironic. And there's been all this talk that these young people are here to save us from the labor movement, are here to save the labor movement. And they bring with them all this great enthusiasm. And that's what we need to save the labor movement. And I'm here to tell you that's all bullshit. It's great that the young people are coming into the labor movement. It's going to bring a lot of energy. But there are already enough enthusiastic people that want to join unions. The problem is that the barriers in the workplace are so high to union busting that they can't. If we could organize freely without people getting fired, because in 1/3 of all union elections, somebody gets fired from their job, or they threaten to move the factory overseas, which we see in about half all cases. Only in 1 out of 6 union organizing drives do the workers ever get a contract. If we could just improve that number, we could save the labor movement. Young people coming in is great, it helps. I hope it gets some new ideas. I hope it shakes up all the people on 16th Street, the people that run the labor movement. but that's not going to save the labor movement. You know, and it's interesting because after Wisconsin, there's been all these great articles that come out, and I'm guilty of writing them, that are sort of like, you know, there's all this great energy coming into the labor movement after Wisconsin, and, you know, maybe we save the labor movement, maybe we don't. It's not clear, right? That's what all these articles say. But nobody ever says, like, what's needed to save the labor movement. It's always like, well, maybe we do, maybe we don't. I don't know. Even I've written this article, this great, I don't know. Well, I don't know, maybe we save the labor movement. And that's not a really good answer for a journalist to give. I don't know, or provide any perspective. And the really tough things the labor movement has to do, not just the labor movement, but the progressive movement, and as well as this country, if we want to save the labor movement. And these are never talked about. And they're not talked about for three reasons. One, they're pretty controversial. They upset people in the labor movement. Two, a lot of editors consider them quite boring stories. And three, the reason they consider them quite boring stories is progressives really don't care all that much about labor. I mean, they do, but not nearly as much as on some of the other hot-button issues of the day. And so let me talk about the first one. There are three things that are killing the labor movement right now in this country. Three primary things that are making it tough to organize. One is outsourcing, is that most of the union jobs are getting shipped overseas. And if they're not getting shipped overseas, if you try to organize your factory, the first thing they're going to tell you is, you unionize, we're shipping the plant to China. And everybody's going to think twice about voting in a union when they hear that. So that's the big one. The second one is union busting. The penalty in this country for firing somebody from their job during a union organizing drive is you have to post a piece of paper on a wall saying, I illegally fired somebody. Now, if the penalty for bank robbing was we all had to post a piece of paper saying we robbed a bank, we'd all be bank robbers. In fact, it is that if you're the head of a Wall Street bank. I mean, you don't even have to do that. So that's the penalty in this country. But the third thing is that we have the most incompetent, overpaid labor movement in the world. The absolute most incompetent, overpaid labor movement in the world. And one of the most docile ones. Few people got my April Fool's joke this year. My joke was, on Twitter, was breaking. AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka joins Move On in calling for GE CEO Jeff Immelt to step down from the Jobs Commission after not paying his taxes. That was an April Fool's joke. Because I've talked to Rich about that on a number of occasions, and what Rich tells me is, I don't criticize the president in public that way. We talk about these things in private. Now, is that something for a labor movement leader to say? I mean, that sounds like the Terry McAuliffe of labor movement leaders. In these times, give money. I'll bring this up a couple more times. So back to the subject. And not only that, there's an incredible waste of money going on in the labor movement. My father is a union organizer with UE, United Electrical Workers. My great-uncle was and my great-aunt was, and I worked there. In UE, they believe that the organizers should feel like the members, not for the members. And so they cap the salaries of their union officials at $65,000 a year. Now, this is good. You know, I'd be happy if I make $65,000 a year. I don't even make half that as a labor journalist. But in the labor movement right now, the leaders are paid enormous salaries. For example, there's a study that's been done taking Department of Labor statistics, because every union has to cite what they pay their union officials. And if you cap the salary of every labor leader at $150,000, you could save the labor movement $149 million a year. Now, if you cap the salary of every union official in the country at $150,000, there's 1,200 union officials in this country that make above $150,000. You could save the labor movement $149 million a year. Put that in perspective, the labor movement spent $300 million on the last election. It's a lot of money. That's a lot of money that can be saved. And this is incredible. In the last 10 years, the number of union officials making over $150,000 has tripled, while membership has declined. So this isn't performance bonuses here. And this is at a time when they're laying off people my age from unions, people making $30,000 a year. So anyhow, this is one of the other issues. And the other issue is that labor issues are considered boring. Let me ask something. And they don't get picked up by a lot of publications. Everybody in this room has heard of Madison, Wisconsin. Let me ask how many people have heard about a different labor struggle. Who's heard about the lockout in Metropolis, Illinois? Can I see a show of hands? The Honeywell plant? There's a Honeywell uranium facility where there's a lockout. I maybe saw 7 or 8 people. There have been workers that work a uranium enrichment facility in southern Illinois. And the boss of the facility was illegally storing radioactive mud behind the plant, and it was leaking into the river. So the union decided to tell the EPA about this, and the boss's response was during the next contract negotiation, he decided to lock out the entire workforce because he didn't want a workforce that could call the EPA and tell them about radioactive materials leaching into the Ohio River. And this CEO just so happens to be the right-hand man of the president, Obama. He was the president's appointment to the Deficit Commission. And while these workers were locked out, the president of the United States flew to India on Air Force One with the CEO, who's the head of the U.S.-India Forum. And he's the #1 contributor to the Democratic Party. And we've shown, conclusively, I've shown this in some of my reporting, that Honeywell, in order to bring in scabs during the lockout, cheated on safety tests. And there have been a number of accidents at this plant since the scabs have been in it during the last 9 months. There have been explosions. There have been releases of HF6 gas into the atmosphere. There have been releases of toxic material overflowing directly into the Ohio River. And you probably haven't heard about this because most editors find local labor struggles boring because they're not political. The reason why Madison, I'm wrapping up here, Madison got so much coverage was because it was a political spectacle, people occupying a Capitol. The reason Republic Windows got so much coverage was because it was a spectacle, people occupying a factory. But 300 workers in southern Illinois fighting against the right-hand man of the president, David Cody, and Honeywell's the #1 contributor to the Democratic Party. 300 workers, that's not an important story to most editors. I mean, this is something that you think you would see on cable news. And the reason is that a lot of progressives tend to view labor struggles that happen somewhere as local. You know, this is just 300 workers, 300 rednecks in southern Illinois. But the boss doesn't see it that way. When a corporation is able to lock out or abuse its workers in one place, it sends a signal to every corporation down the line that we can push these guys around and they can take it. And then, they've shown throughout Kentucky, they show photos of where the scabs at this uranium facility live to workers considering going out on strike. And they say, you guys want to be treated like that? We'll do it. And so I'll leave it for that. But, yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. That was a cruel comment that Mike made about being the only one under 25 or around 25 as a veteran, because I'm going to now call on another wise person. I'm not going to even touch on Steve Early's biography because it seems to me that he's been around a long time in a lot of places. He too has written a book. Well, he's written one I've read called Embedded with Labour, Organised Labour, which is great. And I look forward to reading the next one, whose title I've forgotten, but it will come back to me. Steve Early.
I want to thank everybody for coming out in such large numbers to this event. Clearly, we didn't succumb to the temptations of the whiskey priest down the street here last night. Amazed with this turnout. I want to thank Brother Granville all the way from the UK for putting this important discussion together. Just out of curiosity, let's do a quick survey. How many folks in the room are past or present union members? You could raise your hands. Oh my God, this is like a Sunday morning union membership meeting. What a union-labeled crowd. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences as a kind of participatory labor journalist based here in Boston. I've been involved in dealing with mainstream media institutions covering labor activity in the Northeast for the last 30 years. Much of that time I spent on the payroll of the Communication Workers of America, which is ably represented at the conference here this weekend by my brothers and sisters from the Newspaper Guild, led by Brother Bernie Lunzer. If they would take a bow. We also have, at a competing session, a great guy, Jim Joyce, the head of the Broadcast Technicians Division of CWA. Anybody else from NABIT in the room? They're probably listening to Jim, if they're here with him. And we also have some great local union leaders from WGBH. Is Jordan still here? Jordan Weinstein. Sure, in the discussion period, we're going to talk a little bit about their current contract fight. The AEEF at GBH is also a CWA affiliate. and a very active presence on the local labor scene. I, as an international union rep and organizer, dealt with papers like the Boston Globe and the Herald, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, a lot of other smaller regional papers. When I was involved in helping CWA members and members of the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers on 6 major telecom strikes over the last 20 to 25 years involving 75 to 500,000 workers, very high-profile struggles. I also got to know some of these reporters in their capacity as union members, people who were members of the Guild in the newsroom at the Herald, or at the Globe, or in electronic media outlets like GBH, and had their own union issues and problems and concerns and complaints. Since 1980, I've also been a frequent freelance contributor to the Globe, less so to the Herald, trying to write op-ed pieces and for other parts of the paper about labor-related issues. In my own personal capacity as a member of the National Writers Union, UAW. Let's recognize the NWU members in the room, Sue and others who are here, distributing some very relevant material about the joint TNG-NWU boycott of Huffington Post, which had the audacity, as we know, to not pay aspiring young labor journalists like my friend Brother Elk here. I just want to second everything that everybody has said about the problem of bad framing of labor stories in the mainstream media, the disappearance of the labor beat, the hostility certainly of right-wing outlets like Fox News, the growing trend towards public sector employee and union bashing that has been somewhat counteracted, as John so vividly pointed out, by the inspiring upsurge of workers and their allies in Wisconsin. But I'm going to address a different and more sensitive topic in my few minutes here. It's already been raised in one of the excellent questions that's been submitted. I'm going to be a little off message and go further into the area explored briefly by Brother Elk, and that is the degree to which organized labor's PR wounds are sometimes self-inflicted. Not all bad coverage that unions get is undeserved, unfortunately. Their own internal dysfunction, lack of democracy and transparency, lack of leadership accountability to the membership in certain unions, organizational behavior, including the misappropriation of union funds, continues to generate bad ink throughout the land in ways that is not going to simply be washed away by PR makeovers or by blaming, as union officials often do, the messenger usually being a rank-and-file whistleblower, or a union reform caucus, or a pro-labor national watchdog group like the Association for Union Democracy, the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, or Labor Notes, which for 30 years has been printing all the news about labor that the official labor press does not see fit to print. Some sample copies in the back. Proud to be associated with Labor Notes. Lest anyone think that union corruption in this our own immediate neighborhood here departed with the cast of The Departed, which was filmed here in South Boston, I would note that some of the biggest labor stories locally here in Boston, the Globe and Herald, have involved corruption, thuggery, violence against rank-and-file members, in Teamsters Local 82, which is the trade show local, represents badly the workers who set up conferences like this one, who do moving and storage work. Members of that local have been battling a junior Hoffa-backed father and son team who have used ex-con muscle to put one member in the hospital with a beating, have used threats and intimidation, have stolen money. The situation got so bad, so embarrassing, that the union's outside review board forced Hoffa to put the local under trusteeship, has generated reams of bad coverage for the entire labor movement locally in both the Globe and the Herald. We have our brothers or as Howie Carr would call them in the Herald, another group of Hibernian highwaymen. How's that for ethnic stereotyping in Boston? This is the brothers in Longshore Local 1066 who came up with an interesting scam of putting their sons, of course they were sons, not daughters, on the seniority list when they were still in diapers, giving them a little bit of a head start in terms of pay and access to work on the docks here in South Boston and Charleston ahead of anybody else not connected who might have showed up at the age of 19 or 20 and met the son of a member and discovered that they had 19 years of seniority. Let's not forget that distinguished alum of the Ironworkers Local 7 here in Boston, my friend, brother Bobby Haynes from the other side of South Boston. He's our AFL-CIO president in Massachusetts. You may have read about him recently on the front page of the Herald. He's also a board member of Blue Cross Blue Shield, and his credibility as a critic of medical cost inflation, not to mention corporate greed, has been undermined by the disclosure of the fact that he receives an additional $75,000 a year on top of his 6-digit paycheck from the state Fed on the board of Blue Cross Blue Shield, which recently approved an $11 million payout to the rather inept CEO of Blue Cross, as part of a severance pay package. Again, a black eye for all of the labor movement, an example of double dipping, even if legal, absolutely inexcusable. These are not, unfortunately, isolated incidents. The head of the CLC in New York was just forced to resign, an operating engineer for double dipping. His predecessor, a fellow named Brian McLaughlin from the IBW, managed to steal $3 million from the State Assembly, from the Central Labor Council, from his own Local 1, even from the Electricians' Little League in Queens. He's now serving a 10-year term, previously one of the highest profile officials in New York State, the labor movement, and as you can imagine, the New York City Tabs had a field day with him. We also have had some problems, which I sadly but angrily chronicle in this book, which just happens to be on sale downstairs, The Civil Wars in U.S. Labor, the problems of corruption in labor's progressive wing, personified by the Service Employees International Union. Lest anyone think that corruption is just a problem of the pale, stale, and male old guard in labor, I advise you to take a look at the section of the book that chronicles the outbreak of corruption in the Service Employees International Union in Southern California over the last few years, where some of the union's leading African American and Latino male and female leaders have gone down in a series of embezzlement schemes. One has already been in and out of jail, another was just jailed, and another who embezzled $1 million from $9 an hour home health care aides awaits federal indictment. All appointed and installed by SEIU President Emeritus Andy Stern. This is grim stuff, but we have to confront it. When you pick up the New York Times a week ago and see that a member of my own generational cohort in the labor movement, Bruce Rayner, another top-ranking official of SEIU, who collects a salary of $350,000 a year, plus chauffeur, plus other benefits representing low-wage workers, has been brought up on charges of not paying for his non-business lunches. It's kind of like that pogo experience we had in the 60s. We have met the enemy, and it's us, or at least some of us, some of the time. And this kind of reoccurring bad press, which undermines the labor movement, its standing in the community, its capacity to be a real force for social justice, an attractive vehicle for millions of non-union workers. These problems can only be addressed not by PR makeovers, but by all of us supporting the important bottom-up grassroots movements for union democracy and reform, like Teamsters for Democratic Union and similar organizations. And I hope that we can discuss this further in the question period. Thank you.
Well, you've had a bit of the underbelly, if you want, of the trade union movement. It's not just an issue in the USA. We've had problems, not as, I must admit, not quite as drastic as some of those in the UK. But in general terms, it seems to me that what we've got now to discuss is to identify where we're going to go, what some of the issues. Now, we've had a huge number of questions, so I'm going to start with one, which is very simple. And in the UK, for a number of years, we had an excellent channel, ITV, which had Union World, where every week you'd get the issues of the week in the trade union movement discussed on a mainstream television. Now, there's one question, very simple, NPR. What would be they have Market Watch on NPR, why not Union Watch? Just kind of a quick response. Is it reasonable? Could it happen?
I can tell you right now, is it reasonable? Absolutely. Could it happen? Not now. And I will tell you that this is kind of one of the great achievements of the right. They have taken a public broadcasting network that is, at best, rigidly centrist, and turned it into sort of like the face of radical left-wing extremism. And as a result, NPR is terrified. NPR is terrified right now to begin to express what is a mainstream view as regards workers' rights, as regards labor, as regards all the issues we're talking about. And so the notion of looking to NPR to start a labor watch or a labor beat program right now, I think is one that, you could launch a big campaign. I think you'd be very frustrated. So let me offer you just a quick alternative notion. I think we already have it. I think we already have a very good, very serious national labor watch program. Doesn't do everything we'd want. We could expand it out. We probably, absolutely should. But Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Goes out and covers these labor stories better than anybody else. And I think one of the things that's very important to understand is that when we talk about these NPR fights that are going on right now, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting moves money out to community radio stations, the radio stations across this country, and helps to sustain them. And as the right in Congress talks about cutting NPR funding, they are also in that discussion talking about cutting a baseline of funding that keeps Democracy Now! In communities across this country. So worry a little less about NPR, worry a lot more about defending Democracy Now! And our community radio stations like WORT in Madison and others across this country right now. That's an essential struggle for Labor Story.
Actually, you know what? I do want to follow up on this. There is a new TV station in this country that's publicly funded that does great labor coverage, except it's not funded by our government, it's funded by the Russian government. RT Has anybody gone on there? Russia Today. It's online. It's in cable markets in New York and D.C. and L.A. and a couple other, in state of Ohio, a couple other places. It's on Dish, and you can watch it for free streaming online. I go on there about once a week, and they call me up all the time because they really enjoy doing labor stories, and they enjoy having debates with union busters, which is incredibly fun because if you watch RT, you can see me debating a union buster and then call him un-American, and then he's like, whoa, you can't question my patriotism. How dare you? That's low to question somebody's patriotism in a political debate. And I'm like, fuck you. But another source of public funding, and this is something I want to bring up, is everybody's citing like ProPublica as this great model of like, you can have a nonprofit media outlet that does collaborations with big papers or publishes stuff on its own and publish really good investigative journalism. ProPublica's budget is about $20 million a year. As I said earlier, labor officials over 150,000, that's like 149 million, or we spent 300 million on the Democrats. We could easily, in the labor movement, establish a really good journalism workshop with a budget of 20 million. It would be really easy to do. And we used to have this in the labor movement, and I think as Steve will point out, when Steve got his start, when he was about my age, which was the mid-70s, he worked for the United Mine Workers, the United Mine Workers newspaper, which in 1975 and in 74 won the National Magazine Award, which is a pretty big deal. And now what counts as labor press or blogs is like really stupid press releases that doesn't do hard-hitting journalism. And I think the labor movement could seriously fund something in this country.
Okay, no other comments? We're right on that one.
One thing just real quick on Mike said that a lot of editors and reporters, I don't know how to turn it on. Mike was mentioning that a lot of editors and reporters see labor stories as local and as boring, which, in this frenetic 24-hour news cycle, just covering the basics of a labor story, I can see how editors would think that. But the reality is they're just such great stories, even for regular people who don't think they care about labor. If reporters are able to find the time to really develop, these fantastic, dramatic human narratives, even the smallest localist labor struggle, I think could get a lot more traction and could be, a weekly feature or whatever it might be if it was kind of approached, in a more narrative-driven way.
Okay. I just want to give a little bit of time because I've received a question which is more of a comment, so forgive me if I read it out. While WGBH in Boston, producers of Nova, Frontline, Masterpiece Theatre, is fighting right-wing attempts in Washington to cut federal funding for public broadcasting, WGBH is using right-wing tactics to bust its largest union of 300 workers. Coincidentally, David H. Koch, I've learned how to pronounce that correctly. Since I learn a lot of things at this conference, one is how to pronounce Koch. David H. Koch sits on the WGBH Board of Trustees, the governing body of WGBH. Coincidence or what? If you want to speak to get more briefing on the dispute, our brother from the union is here, and I've had a press briefing which I'm going to read with interest. Okay, two or three other questions, all link this point. Obviously, we've got, as well as the unions mentioned already, Michael Winship has asked me to note, we are here too, AFL-CIO. The Writers Guild.
Writers Guild of America East.
Yeah, Writers Guild of America East. Yep, so welcome. Two or three questions actually say, and it refers back to, in the UK we have links with the trade union, so we have a media reform group, which is battling at the moment, by the way, I may as well focus it. We are battling against the dark force, the evil force. Rupert Murdoch is, as I speak, seeking to take over B-Sky B in the UK. Rupert Murdoch has been the most pernicious, corrosive, anti-democratic force in UK politics. I'll give you one example. This is free press. I've got some copies. Take some if you want when you leave it. The last Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, a book has just come out in which Lance Price, who was a spin doctor, he was the deputy to Alastair Campbell under Tony Blair, and he actually says in the book, he alleges that Gordon Brown actually sought to abolish the 10% rate of income tax, which was targeted to help the poorest in the UK, because he wanted to curry favour with Rupert and win his support, the support of his newspapers in the run-up to election. That's the danger we have. Now, we have links with the trade unions in the UK. Now, the questions, two or three of them, why is it that we don't have closer links between the National Conference for Media Reform and the other unions, besides the ones that are here today? What's the problem in trying to get that question on the agenda? Anybody want to tackle it? Steve, Harry?
I'll give you a shot at it.
Okay.
It's funny, when the National Conference for Media Reform started, the very first one in Madison, Wisconsin, ironically, in 2003, John Sweeney, who was the president of the AFL-CIO, came to the conference and spoke on the first night. And we had a lot of other national labor leadership there. And we continue to have a lot of members of communications-oriented unions that have remained connected. I want to do a little self-criticism of Free Press, which is a group I helped to co-found, and also the conference, in that I don't think that we have done enough, our side, to go out and do that internal organizing within unions that are not communication unions, and say that and do that education about why media is a labor issue. It's a fundamental labor issue, and they can't win fights unless every labor union is a part of the media reform movement. And so it's one of the things we'll talk about in the closing plenary today. there's a lot that Free Press is a very young organization in the scheme of things. There's a lot that we have learned along the way. One of the things that we are learning now is the folly of presuming that when you elect a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress that you're going to get good legislation and a good agenda. And well, I don't have to tell you that, but I think that those lessons are very powerful, and they teach us that the next time you come to an NCMR, we had better have a lot more people from a lot more unions here, because I love that all these people are in this room, but fundamentally I have to tell you, if we're going to beat this right-wing agenda, which exists not just in the Republican Party, but in a lot of the Democratic Party, we are going to have a much more powerful mass movement, not just for labor rights, but also for radical and aggressive media reform.
So I'll say this, because I know Brother Early is going to disagree with me, and this is the part of the panel where there gets to be some fireworks. I think one of the most regressive things, and I've heard a lot of people here bitch about this week, and a lot of people have come up and talked to me about this. Communications Workers of America is one of the most progressive unions and rank-and-file unions in the country, except when it comes to the issue of net neutrality, which they're opposed to. And I think this is wrong on so many levels. I mean, the basic argument is that we need to have, they have a middle ground. They have the FCC compromise position. I'm not a technical expert. But the basic argument is we need to have some type of leeway for the big telecoms so that they can invest in infrastructure. This is like the same argument that steelworkers and other companies used in the 70s and the 80s to say that we shouldn't fight pollution, that we need to do something for investment. And it's a wrong argument. And there was a labor leader by the name of Tony Mazzocchi, who was the head of the, one of the top heads of the Oil, Atomic, and Chemical Workers Union, which represented atomic workers. And he was opposed to nuclear energy because he realized it was bad, and he called for more and strict regulations on it. And why he said he did this was, you can do the bidding of the boss, but then the boss is your ally, and you lose your other allies in the community. And I think when the labor movement takes a position like that, it's really detrimental, and I think it really turns off a lot of allies. But let me say this. While CWA might be bad on net neutrality, I have not heard enough progressives in this room talking about neutrality agreements for organizing. And the only way we're going to be able to build that bridge is if CWA and unions like that see that they have greater allies here and they can tell the boss, go fuck yourself.
Let me just respond to the original question about the disconnection between the important layer of union activists and the alternative media networks. I think the partly can be explained because there is a lot of suspicion, a lot of wariness, a lot of hostility towards all forms of media. I do a class once a year for the 40 or 50 folks from around the country and the world who come to Cambridge for 6 weeks to the Harvard Trade Union program. The Guild always has 1 or 2 people in the class. It's a class, the session I do on labor in the media, and a lot of the people from the wide range of public and private sector unions in those classes will quickly recount a lot of bad experiences they've had dealing with reporters, instances in which they feel they've been misquoted, they've been burned, the union's misrepresented, the whole list of horror stories. And, Bernie Lunzer's been in that class. I've tried to use the people with actual media experience to explain from the inside how these organizations works, what their strengths and limitations are, what some of the pressures that reporters face, the editors they have to deal with, the constraints they're operating under, the fact that in many cases, some cases, they're fellow union members, and that we have to find ways to relate both to the mainstream media outlets, which are going to cover us for better or worse. You can't stick your head in the sand and ignore them and refuse to comment and not return their calls, which is a way of dealing with the media that's all too widespread in the labor movement. And I think, unfortunately, that laps over to dealing with other groupings trying to challenge the functioning of the mainstream media with the additional recent wrinkle of these tensions about net neutrality.
Okay, thanks for that. A very specific question to Carrie. What inspired you to write about the Republic Window Factory revolt? Well, I could give an answer, but I'll let you do it.
Well, actually, it was, I'd have to give credit to Melville House, the publishing company in Brooklyn. It was actually their idea on the very first day of the occupation, before it was clear what would happen. They were looking for someone to do a really fast book, and I was already covering it. So, that's how the book came about. And it was a great story, and it kept unfolding and sort of getting better, for the course of the 6 months or so that I was doing the book. So it wasn't my brilliant insight, but I felt really lucky to get to do it.
I'm glad you did. It's a great book. It's a great book. This one's to Mike, and it's really going back to the example of the uranium plant, the strike, and it's a specific question about where were the environmental and health interests? You've got powerful lobbies. Why haven't they been raising if you want, or putting the story above the radar?
Yeah, one of the reasons, I think why this story doesn't come up, and this comes to another situation, which is that labor and progressives or environmentalists aren't going to be on the same page, is that environmentalists really don't want to talk about nuclear energy all that much. And I think the union there is very much in favor of it. And I think we're going to have areas where we have distances. Like, I don't agree with CWA on that. And I've heard people call CWA a conservative union, and that there's nothing further than the truth on that issue. And I think it's really an issue of sitting down and understanding others' needs. Like, for example, I wrote a piece on CWA endorsing the T-Mobile Verizon deal. And what you have to realize is that, Verizon is a company that's entirely anti-union in its wireless network, as is Sprint, entirely anti-union. And, AT&T has a card check agreement. This is what the Employee Free Choice Act was about, that you can organize, you just sign cards, there's no boss intimidation session, nobody gets fired, and you're in the contract, And so part of the reason why CWA endorsed that deal was that if T-Mobile went with Sprint, you would have two huge competitors in the telecom industry that were anti-union at a competitive advantage over the one company that's union. So it was a question over whether or not you wanted a unionized telecom, which quite frankly, I agree with CWA on this. I think it's a better deal for T-Mobile to merge with AT&T than Sprint. And I think it's not ideal. Certainly, there's ways we can regulate them, but I think it's a good deal. Better than them going with Sprint. But a lot of people in the progressive community, such as Joel Kelsey, who I talked with, just bashed them off the bat. These guys aren't progressives, they don't give a shit about anybody else, et cetera, et cetera. And we see this on a number of instances where a lot of people in the progressive community don't pay attention. Like, look at Credo Mobile, right? Everybody's like buying minutes off of Credo Mobile is this great thing, it funds the progressive movement. Well, Credo buys minutes from Sprint, and Sprint fires tons of workers every single year for trying to join a union. So your money is going right to union busters when you do that. So I think there's just not enough understanding between progressives on some of these tricky issues, such as, nuclear energy, et cetera, that, somebody might work at a nuclear energy plant, they don't necessarily like it, or maybe they do like it, but we don't need to get all secretarian, ISO meeting style on them,
Maybe we should send the tape of this to CWA, and they'll could possibly rehire Mike. I just, one cautionary note, this labeling of unions as conservative, as progressive, very dangerous. They are large, sprawling, diverse organizations. I'd be careful of those kinds of labels. There are certain unions, as I think I was trying to point out initially, great in the area of resolutionary activity. They're for gay rights, they're for immigrant rights, they've passed resolutions against our foreign wars, all fine and good. Their actual content, their functioning, their day-to-day structure, the way they relate to their members is in some cases far from progressive. So I think, for people approaching the labor movement, I wouldn't put unions, including my own alma mater, CWA, in one category or another, because they don't always fit and apply.
Okay, thanks. I want to a couple of questions. One, I partly referred to when I quoted from Laura Flanders about the linkage between events in Egypt, Tunisia, and so on. The question is, do you think that events in Tunisia and Egypt and the accompanying media coverage were the catalyst for the Wisconsin protests? I think a quick one on this, please.
Very quick. Molly Stentz out there from WORT. I promise you, we're not going to we'll just be a quick sec. Molly, come on, run up here for 1 sec. Fast. I got a million answers for this question. I got a million answers for this question. I'm going to let the best reporter in Madison, the person who covered every aspect of it, come up and answer that question. Molly Stentz, the news director of WORT, our community radio station in Madison that covered every aspect from the very beginning of this struggle.
Day 55. Absolutely. And, not only were people inspired, and, people tried to make a lot of connections between Mubarak and Walker, and there was all debate about that, but it was definitely the imagining of the possible, that sparked the imaginations of people in Madison and across Wisconsin. And in fact, I feel like the other story that's not being told is what Wisconsin has inspired in other states. I'm just getting messages now that the occupation in the Washington Capitol, right, in Olympia, Washington, is still going on despite the fact the governor had them all dragged out. So we've seen this in Michigan. Yeah, Michigan, Washington, Ohio. I mean, things are happening. It's not getting the coverage that Wisconsin got because they don't have the people. They don't have the same numbers. But it's been incredibly inspiring. So these things really do matter, the coverage. And the only thing I wanted to say about community media, as John mentioned earlier, it's so vital that if you have a local station in your community, that you give it support. Because the reason that we were able to do coverage was because 35 years ago, members of our community in Madison had the foresight to create the station then that exists today that pushed out the coverage. We were there every day because our station was 6 blocks from the state capitol, and we had the infrastructure, and we had the ability to respond immediately. We had the connections. We started doing stories. We had reporters from around the country coming to us, using our studios. We had film crews, TV crews, radio crews, producers from NPR stations, from community radio stations. We had the BBC calling us in. What's going on in Wisconsin, And we were able to push the stories out of local people because we were there, because we had the infrastructure. And so the time to respond to a crisis with coverage is not after the fact. That you need to have that infrastructure in your community so that you will be able to cover the stories. So if you have a community radio station or an independent station or independent press or independent magazines, you have to support that in your community if you want it to be there for you when these struggles happen in your community. And if you don't have a low-power station, an LPFM station, now's the time, folks. When they open the window, now's the time. And if they're not doing local news, tell them it's the future. They have to do it to be relevant to the community. Get in the local news department. That's my plug.
Molly Stentz. Molly Stentz from WORT. Molly Stentz.
Okay,
Can
I've got to
I
give...
follow up on what Molly said there really quick about why Wisconsin's gotten so much coverage and other stories haven't? And this gets to the issue that a lot of labor struggles are considered boring unless they're spectacular, unless there's a capital occupation, and not even. I've seen so many fascinating stories die on the vein, especially even by progressive editors. For instance, there was a town, I came up here a few months ago, and I stayed with Steve, in Taunton, Massachusetts, where they were going to close a factory that had been there for 80 years, and the town decided, we're not going to let them ship this factory to Mexico because it's profitable. We're going to declare eminent domain and take back the factory, not let them move it. Great story. Only problem was they got bottled up in court, and they were able to scrap all the equipment in the factory. Now, I had written up the story. I traveled up. I talked to the workers, and I went to the editor, and the editor said to me, well, Mike, since the workers lost, we just don't feel it's that interesting. And we've seen that dozens of times, is that editor, one editor said to me when I first moved to D.C. was, workers getting screwed is an old story. Everybody knows that story. But it's a story that's really important to the workers.
Okay, I've just been given a couple of cards. A great ally to unions seeking media coverage is Jobs with Justice. And another, could someone please mention WIN, Workers' Independent News, the most successful labor radio project in 50 years in the US. I'm glad I've learned another thing. I didn't know about it. I'll check it out.
And WIN's, of course, headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin. And Wait, as long as we're all just riffing off stuff here, can I just one final thing too? Molly said it so very well, but and that on the Egypt question, just to circle around, my favorite sign about 3 days in, heavy snow coming down, about 10 degrees out there, some guy walking along holding up a sign that said, "I thought Cairo would be warmer." Everybody was inspired, and everybody, as Mike points out so importantly, everybody is inspired when we tell these stories. There is no boring story. There are only bad and inept reporters that don't know how to tell a good story. And the fact of the matter is, if we empower more young reporters and more mid-career reporters to get out there and give them the forums to tell these stories, they're going to inspire. The thing I keep saying to people is, imagine if over the last 30 years we had had good labor coverage in the United States. Imagine how powerful our labor movements and our community movements would be. You know the answer. Labor would be a dominant force in this country if it had been covered well for the last 30 years. That's what inspires people, not just Egypt, but the stories right here in America.
Thank you. Okay, we're even just getting cards in at the last minute, and I'm really sorry, but I'll read the question, and maybe we're going to just have a short 1-minute roundup. I'll give you the question I'm going to ask you. It's really, give us one recipe, if you want, one thing that you think we could do immediately as a result of this session to improve Labour coverage in our media. Just one idea that we can take away with us. We've heard some already, but this was the question that you asked. And everybody does it. There's a romantic still aura, isn't there? What if Woodward and Bernstein, along with the Post, had covered Watergate the way Labour is covered? I mean, that's a question. Okay, so we've got it's now just after 25, or nearly getting up towards 25 too. So just to round up so that people can go away some positive ideas and thoughts to take back to their communities. Let's start with Steve.
Well, I think the key challenge, obviously, in a situation where only 12% of the workforce is union represented at this time, we're constantly looking for ways to overcome this spirit of begrudgerism that is spread and fanned and promoted by the corporate-backed media and the employers. John alluded to it, this notion that the less well-off, the have-nots, should be focusing all of their anger and resentment on the have-a-littles while the have-a-lots get off the hook. The only way that workers fighting to defend job security, decent pensions, employer-paid medical coverage under the remaining union contracts that we have in this country, when they're fighting these defensive battles, the only way these struggles are going to resonate with the broader population if we frame them as a fight for the broader working class, not just our own dwindling band of members. And that involves doing what the Teamsters did at UPS in 1997 when they're fighting for job security, making that an issue about part-time jobs throughout the economy, when we're fighting against healthcare cost shifting, demanding real national health insurance, healthcare for all, and when we're fighting to defend defined benefit pensions, making a broader issue about the inadequacy of Social Security, because otherwise people who have already lost these things or never had them, never had the right to bargain about them, are not going to be too sympathetic to our struggles.
I guess as a working reporter who has to develop these ideas and sell them to editors in order to do labor stories, just very pragmatically, maybe less inspirationally than Steve's advice, but very pragmatically, if you're involved in a labor struggle or if you have deep knowledge of an ongoing labor struggle, just pitch it to a reporter and pitch it in a way that is very focused and emphasizes the characters involved and the very specific narrative that's going on there. And I would actually advise on your first pitch not to include the sort of grander context and hopefully work with the reporter later to make sure that gets in there, but just try to sell it as a very doable, important, good story. And I think a critical mass of those stories will add up to a big improvement in labor coverage. Yeah, and exactly, and click on all the labor stories so that shows up in the in the web analysis, and write to editors. Just let media know that people do want these stories.
if you want to do one thing that's really easy to support labor coverage, you can give money to In These Times. And, you know, I'm just saying, I need it. You know, another thing you can do is write editors at big publications and tell them to hire a labor reporter. Ariana Huffington, after ripping off everybody's free labor, including my own, decided, you know, she got $200 million in the AOL cell, and she doesn't have a single labor reporter on staff. Occasionally they might cover a labor story, but she doesn't have somebody that goes out and covers strikes and lockouts and organizing drives. And this is pathetic. And it's pathetic the other publications that don't. The Washington Post doesn't. You know, a number of progressive magazines sometimes have labor stories, but, you know, they have full-time war correspondents and full-time other correspondents, but not labor reporters. And, you know, that's something else I should bring up on this panel, is that none of the 5 of us on this panel really can fully make a living full-time as a labor reporter, and we're some of the best known in our field. I mean, Steve is retired and has a pension and does some trainings on top of his work and writes a book. Yeah. You know, Carrie does some teaching, some photography, some odds and ends, and does a lot of great stuff and has written some books. I'm young enough that I can still borrow money off my parents. And John, you know, yeah, this is a great story. You know, John Nichols is a great guy. I never met John. I show up at Madison at 11 o'clock at night after traveling for 12 hours. And it's like a sleet storm. And I show up at John's house, which was kind of like, you know, like the oasis for everybody from out of town. I show up there, and I've never met John before. And he's like, well, hey, do you want to go up to the Capitol? And I say, oh, okay, it's like 8 blocks. He says, oh, you can take my car. In the middle of an ice storm. And I never met him before. He's a great guy. But, you know, the other thing is...
I still don't have my car back.
You can support a lot of publications, and I think also put pressure on editors. If you give money to a publication like The Nation, write them and tell them more labor coverage.
I think it's falling my way. Everything they said. And here's a buck.
You're supposed to give it to In These Times.
I'll give it straight to you. It gets it. They don't take their cut. Number one, support unions that organize people in the field of communications. We need the Newspaper Guild, NABIT, our friends from WGBH, I get that right, I'm not a Bostonian, and other unions that do this work after. They are too small. They need to be dramatically larger. And so number one, if you've got a union local in your community that represents communication workers, if you're a free press media reform activist, reach out to them and make a connection with them. They will love to meet you, and you will love their commitment. Bernie Lunzer, president of the Newspaper Guild, is right back there, and I can tell you, in any community where there's a guild local, they would love to have a bunch of media reform activists come in and help them fight their labor struggles right now to keep reporters on the job. So support unions that are in the field trying to do this work. And then the last, quickly, number two, Lisa Graves, who is in the second from back row there. Stand up, Lisa. She's from the Center for Media and Democracy out in Madison. And can I just, yes, CMD. And can I just tell you, this is a critical thing. Do not wait for the cavalry to come. When the struggle in Madison began, Molly and her crew, mostly volunteer, switched over to cover this struggle. But the online coverage of this struggle has come from the Center for Media and Democracy. They switched their entire staff over and said, we've got history happening here, we have a great labor struggle happening here, and we're going to actually hire reporters, laid-off reporters from publications in town, and send them out to cover every aspect of this struggle. So if you go to prwatch.org, you can see that coverage, and it is so good, and it was created from day one of this struggle, and it tells you the biggest answer of all. If labor's not being covered well in your community, don't wait for the paper to do it. Don't wait for TV to do it. Don't wait for radio, commercial radio to do it. If need be, go out and do it yourselves, and you will do it better than mainstream media has been doing it. Thank you for being here.
Okay. We've run over a little bit, but I just got to read one announcement, and it's for people around the Boston area. Greater Boston Labour Council mobilised to restore the American dream and a fair economy for working families. Thursday, April the 14th, 2011, 4 p.m. rally in the Boston Financial District, 125 High Street, Boston. Okay, so I just want to wind up. I think it's been great. We've left lots of questions unanswered, but at least we put it back on the agenda, that the Labour beat and reporting on the struggles of working people for a decent living, decent wages, and representation is important. So I want to thank the panel and thank you for turning out. And one last point, book signings down there. If you want free press, it's here. And if you want to buy a copy of Shafted, it's here. Thank you.
Randall Williams.